It always starts the same way. She looks at you like you're the answer to something she's been aching to remember. There's something in her eyes. Soft, curious, hungry. But it's not hunger for you as you are. It's hunger for a story she's been rehearsing since she was young. And in that moment, you're not being seen. You're being cast. You feel chosen, like you've finally been found. The intensity hits fast. There's vulnerability in her voice, secrets shared quickly, a sense of familiarity that feels almost sacred. She tells you you're different. She makes you feel like home. And somewhere deep in your chest, something opens. A forgotten part of you stirs, something ancient and unspoken. Maybe it's the boy in you who always longed to be fully understood. Maybe it's the man who believed that this time it would be safe to finally be seen. But here's the truth you probably don't want to admit yet. What you're falling into isn't love. It's a loop, a mirror, a beautifully packaged illusion designed not by her, but by something much older, by the unconscious. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate." That's what this is. You're calling it fate, chemistry, magic, but it's not. It's projection. You think you're falling in love, but what you're actually falling into is your own shadow, wrapped in her form. You're not drawn to her because of who she is. You're drawn because of what she represents. An emotional code your nervous system learned in childhood. Inconsistent love. Approval wrapped in mystery. Attention that's intense one moment and vanishing the next. The kind of emotional experience that's not stable, but familiar. That's the trick of the shadow feminine. She doesn't control you with force. She controls you with confusion, with the illusion of being deeply seen. She mirrors your strengths at first, admires your confidence, praises your presence, but slowly, and often without even realizing it herself, she begins to withdraw. Her energy shifts, her tone cools, her attention becomes selective, delayed. You sense something's wrong, but nothing is said. You try harder, you think it's your fault. This is the beginning of the invisible game. Jung warned us about this. He called it the unconscious projection of the anima, the inner feminine image that exists inside every man. And when that inner image is unresolved or unintegrated, it gets projected onto real women. You don't see her clearly. You see your fantasy, your need, your ache. And she, driven by her own unconscious forces, projects too. The shadow feminine inside her doesn't scream or fight. She doesn't throw things or raise her voice. No, she operates in silence. She withholds. She makes you question yourself. She offers moments of deep connection, then pulls away, leaving you starving for another taste. It feels like rejection, but more than that, it feels like a test. You're desperate to pass. Because now you're chasing, not just her, but the version of her you first met, the one who made you feel alive. You start walking on eggshells, overanalyzing every text, doubting yourself, apologizing for things that aren't even yours to carry. Your center of gravity shifts from within to her. This is where self-abandonment begins. And here's the brutal truth. The more she withdraws, the more effort you give. You start trying to earn something that once seemed freely given. You rationalize her distance, make excuses for her mood swings, try to be better. You think if you just show her how safe you are, how patient, how understanding, she'll come back to that version of herself you first met. But she won't, because that version wasn't real. It was never stable. It was a projection, both yours and hers. You were both meeting in the fog of fantasy, in the dream world of unconscious wounds colliding. That's why it felt so powerful. That's why it felt like destiny, because, on a soul level, your wounds recognized each other. And now, you're bleeding for a woman who may not even be aware of what she's doing. That's what makes it so dangerous. The shadow feminine isn't always malicious. She's often unaware, just like you didn't know you were handing your power away, one compromise at a time. You start explaining yourself more. You question whether you're too much or not enough. You shrink your need to preserve the connection. You forget how to say no. You confuse peacekeeping with love. You call it loyalty, but what it really is abandonment of yourself. You keep hoping that if you just love harder, show up more, prove your worth in clearer ways, she'll return to the version you fell for. But that version only existed in the beginning for a reason, to pull you in. It's not that she faked it, it's that she too was under the spell of projection. You were her ideal, her puzzle piece. Until you weren't. This is the cycle Jung mapped out so clearly. Two unconscious psyches colliding, each projecting, each reacting, not to reality, but to wounds dressed up as love. And the tragedy is this: the longer you stay, the more you forget who you are. Because every time you choose to chase instead of pause, every time you bend instead of stand, you reinforce a false story, a story that says love must be earned, that connection must hurt to feel real, that your worth is measured by how well you tolerate emotional chaos. But love isn't supposed to feel like survival. Chemistry isn't always sacred. Sometimes it's just trauma bonding in disguise. You weren't weak for falling for her, you were unconscious. And now you have a choice: keep playing the invisible game or start waking up. Waking up doesn't look like some dramatic confrontation. It doesn't always come with closure or even clarity at first. It begins in silence. In the moment you pause and ask yourself, what am I doing? It's not a loud rebellion, it's the quietest whisper of truth. And that's enough to crack the illusion. You start seeing the pattern, not just with her, but with others before her. The same emotional roller coaster, the same high followed by the same fall. Different face, same storm. That's when you realize the problem isn't her, it's your unconscious loyalty to suffering. The invisible game plays out like a script you didn't even know you were reading from, and each time you repeat the pattern, it reinforces the story you carry about love and worth. But here's what Jung teaches us that changes everything. It's not about blaming her. It's not about demonizing the feminine. It's about finally owning the projection. She may be the mirror, but the reflection is yours. The shadow feminine is powerful, not because she destroys you, but because she forces you to meet the parts of yourself you've ignored. The needy part, the pleasing part, the part that longs to be seen but is terrified of rejection, the part that would rather lose himself than lose someone else. These aren't flaws, they're fragments, and they rise to the surface because the relationship has become a pressure cooker for your unconscious. You weren't just trying to love her. You were trying to fix something in you, through her. That's why you stayed when it hurt. That's why you excused the distance, the manipulation, the emotional whiplash. You thought healing would come through her return. That if you could just win her back, you'd finally prove something. But the truth is, love that costs you yourself is never worth keeping. You can't heal a wound by feeding it. You heal by facing it. And here's the hard truth most men don't want to admit. We often stay in toxic dynamics, not because we're blind, but because we're addicted, not to the person, but to the intensity. Emotional chaos feels alive. The highs are euphoric and the lows devastating. It gives your nervous system something to chase, something to fight for, something to survive. But survival is not the same as love. You think you're proving your strength by staying, but strength isn't in endurance, it's in discernment. It's in knowing when to walk away, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. When you begin to awaken, you start recognizing the signs of the invisible game, the delayed texts, the praise followed by distance, the emotional tests that always shift the goalposts, the intimacy that comes with a shadow of anxiety. You begin to notice that the love you were fighting for doesn't feel like love anymore. It feels like performance, like you're always trying to pass a test that was never meant to have a winner. That's where the shift begins. When you start asking not, how do I get her back, but instead, why am I still trying to earn what should be given freely? You begin to reclaim your power. And power isn't about control. It's about presence, emotional presence, boundaried presence. The kind of presence that says, I can love you and still walk away if you start costing me myself. That kind of presence destabilizes manipulation because the shadow feminine thrives in unawareness. It feeds on your confusion, your lack of boundaries, your desperate need to fix, to save, to be enough. When you stop engaging with the game, you shift the dynamic, not to punish, but to step outside the loop. You realize that the more you tried to be chosen, the more you abandoned yourself, and no amount of being chosen by someone else will ever make up for choosing yourself too late. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming whole, not through another, but through the integration of all your disowned parts, the shadow, the anima, the wounded masculine, the forgotten self. Individuation isn't pretty. It's not romantic. It's brutal. Because it demands that you stop looking outward for the love you haven't given yourself. It forces you to feel the void you've been covering with chaos. It requires solitude, reflection, accountability, and yes, grief. Because you're not just letting go of a person, you're letting go of a pattern, a fantasy, an addiction to emotional survival dressed as intimacy. You're mourning the story you told yourself about what this could have been, and more importantly, you're mourning the version of yourself that believed he had to suffer to be loved. But on the other side of that grief is something else, something stronger. Not the armor of numbness, not the false confidence of, I don't need anyone, but the quiet power of awareness, the ability to feel without falling apart, to give without losing, to love without abandoning. Because here's the deepest truth, the relationship was never really with her. It was with yourself, projected outward. She was the reflection, the mirror, the test, and when you pass that test, not by fixing her, but by facing yourself, you don't just end a pattern, you evolve out of it. You become untouchable, not because you built walls, but because you finally know who you are beneath the roles. You become magnetic, not because you play games, but because your energy is no longer leaking through unhealed wounds. You become sovereign, not because you reject intimacy, but because you've learned to bring your whole self into it. And when you reach that point, something strange happens. The chaos doesn't excite you anymore. The mixed signals don't feel seductive. They feel immature. The emotional high you once chased feels noisy, exhausting, unnecessary. Because peace has become more attractive than intensity, clarity has replaced confusion, and love, real love, no longer requires you to disappear to feel worthy of it. You start seeing the shadow feminine when she appears, but now you don't chase her. You don't try to rescue, to prove, to pass her test. You simply watch, observe, and walk away if necessary. Not out of punishment, out of mastery. Because the invisible game only has power when you don't know you're playing it. But now you do. Now you begin to notice what you never saw before, not because it wasn't there, but because you were too deep in your unconscious patterns to recognize it. You start to feel the difference between connection and enmeshment, between love and longing, between presence and performance. What used to feel like chemistry now feels like chaos. You don't mistake emotional volatility for depth anymore. You don't crave intensity the way you used to. In fact, the more peaceful something feels, the more alive you feel in its presence. And this is where the real transformation begins. You realize that the shadow feminine, in all her confusion and contradiction, was never your enemy. She was the initiator, the unintentional teacher. She pulled you into the fire not to destroy you, but to awaken the parts of you still trapped in self-forgetting. Every manipulation you endured, every withdrawal you tried to decode, every test you thought you had to pass, all of it pointed back to one thing: your relationship with your own worth. She didn't strip you of your power. She showed you where you'd already given it away. And that is where the invisible game starts to dissolve, when you stop trying to win it, when you finally sit in the silence of your own truth and admit what you've known all along, that you've been fighting to be chosen by someone who cannot even choose themselves, that you've been performing for someone who doesn't know what authenticity looks like, that you've been emotionally bleeding just to prove you're still alive. That's what this game does. It makes you forget your center. It convinces you that emotional instability is love, that withdrawal is mystery, that attention is affection. But when you begin to see clearly, when you stop gaslighting your own intuition, you recognize the patterns for what they are: echoes. Echoes of every unresolved wound you haven't yet met within yourself. Jung wrote that the psyche will compensate for every piece of us we abandon, and until we go inward, the people we attract will keep carrying those abandoned parts to the surface, often in painful ways. You don't break the cycle by intellectualizing it, you break it by integrating the shadow. And integration doesn't happen overnight. It begins with attention, radical, honest, unfiltered attention to your emotional truth. Where do you collapse your boundaries? Where do you compromise your needs to maintain peace? Where do you mistake approval for connection? These are not casual questions. These are the doors to your freedom. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you feel the cost of playing the invisible game, you lose your appetite for it. It no longer excites you to chase someone who can't meet you. It no longer feels noble to love someone at the expense of your peace. You stop showing up to emotional battles where the prize is your own disintegration. That's not love, that's self-erasure dressed in hope. But here's the paradox. As you withdraw from the game, as you reclaim your center, something inside you grieves. Not just for the person you thought she was, but for the version of you that kept trying to earn love through suffering. You mourn the boy who learned that affection must be worked for. You mourn the man who thought loyalty meant staying even when it was hurting. You mourn the illusion that someone else's chaos was your responsibility to fix. And yet, within that grief lies your rebirth. You start to build a different kind of strength, not the performative, stoic strength that pretends nothing hurts, but the quiet, grounded strength of someone who knows where they end and another begins. You no longer need to be everything for someone else. You don't need to be perfect, impressive, or endlessly patient. You just need to be whole, to be real, to be rooted in truth, even if that truth is messy, even if it costs you someone you thought you couldn't live without. Because now you see the trap for what it was, the idea that love should be a test, that worth is proven through pain, that devotion requires self-destruction. You see how deep the pattern ran, how it showed up in your friendships, your family, your self-talk. You realize that it wasn't about her, she was just the trigger, the mirror, the mask your unconscious used to get your attention. And maybe, for the first time in your life, you decide to stop chasing, not just her, but anyone. You stop chasing validation, performance, rescue missions. You stop chasing love that doesn't see you, because you're too busy building something more sacred: self-relationship, emotional self-trust, the kind of internal clarity that makes manipulation lose its power. That's the thing they never tell you. When you heal, the games no longer work on you. You don't need to yell, expose, or retaliate. You just stop engaging. Your detachment is no longer a performance, it's a boundary. And people who once relied on your activity, your emotional generosity, your confusion, they start to fall away. Not because you pushed them out, but because you stopped playing the role. This is what Jung meant by individuation. Becoming whole isn't about becoming untouchable, it's about becoming so integrated that you no longer seek completion in someone else. It's about knowing your own shadow so deeply that no one else can use it against you. It's about loving with an open heart, but never again abandoning yourself in the name of connection. You no longer fear being alone because solitude has become your sanctuary. You've seen what it's like to be surrounded by attention yet starved for respect. You've lived the agony of being physically close but emotionally erased, and now silence feels like truth. Stillness feels like clarity, Peace isn't boring anymore, it's holy. And as you walk forward, not bitter, not guarded, but conscious, something beautiful happens. You begin attracting different people, people who aren't interested in playing games, people who have faced their own shadow and done the work, people who see you clearly because they've learned to see themselves. But even more than that, you begin to trust yourself, to trust your gut, to honor your emotions, to choose your needs. You stop second-guessing your instincts. You stop needing confirmation before you act. You know who you are now, and that knowing is the most powerful thing you've ever owned. This isn't the end of love, this is its beginning, because now when love comes, you'll recognize it not by how intense it feels, but by how safe you feel in its presence. Not by how much it excites your nervous system, but by how much it calms your soul. Love that doesn't require losing yourself. Love that doesn't confuse your spirit. Love that doesn't awaken old wounds, but helps heal them gently, steadily, consciously. And when you meet someone who offers that, you won't hesitate. Not because you need them, but because you finally know what you're worth. It's strange, isn't it? How the things that once captivated you now feel like warning signs. How the magnetic pull of emotional unpredictability doesn't hypnotize you anymore, it repels you. That's what awakening does. It sharpens your awareness. It tunes your nervous system to a new frequency. Not one of survival, but of self-respect. You used to chase after mixed signals and moody silences, thinking it was romantic tension. Now you see it as a test of how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice for a connection that was never mutual to begin with. The version of you that needed constant reassurance, who feared abandonment like death, that version has been met now, seen, held, not by someone else, but by you. You no longer treat your wounds like weaknesses. You understand they were maps, leading you back to the parts of yourself you left behind in the name of love, approval, and belonging. Jung said that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration. And you are living proof of that truth. You stopped running from the discomfort. You faced the mirror. You took back your name. And with that comes something even more profound. Peace. Not the kind you pretend to have when everything is falling apart behind your eyes, but the real kind. The peace that comes from knowing you won't abandon yourself again, that you won't betray your inner compass just to be chosen by someone who can't even hold themselves together. You feel it in your bones now. Love without clarity is not love. It's a transaction, and you're no longer for sale. You start to notice how different life feels when you're not anxiously decoding messages or rereading old conversations looking for clues. You're not living in your head, building stories out of silence. You're not trying to predict when the next emotional withdrawal will hit or how to fix it. You're present. You're grounded. And that stillness, once so foreign, has become your new home. The invisible game loses its grip the moment you realize you never had to play it in the first place. It was only real because you believed you needed to earn love, because you believed that emotional chaos was proof of emotional depth, because your nervous system had confused trauma with intimacy, but not anymore. Now you crave what nourishes you, not what excites your survival mechanisms. You've outgrown the need to be triggered to feel alive. This shift doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means your feelings are no longer held hostage by someone else's volatility. You become the guardian of your emotional world. You know the difference between connection and control, between tenderness and testing. You trust yourself to walk away at the first sign of manipulation, not because you're cold, but because you're clear. Your clarity is your freedom. Your boundaries are not walls. They're invitations to meet you in truth. And here's what no one tells you about individuation. It's lonely, but it's never empty. You may lose people along the way, the ones who were only there because you overextended, overexplained, overgave, but in their absence you find space. Space to breathe, to feel, to rebuild your relationship with yourself. You don't need a mirror to recognize your worth anymore. You've internalized it. You walk with it, and it speaks louder than any apology ever could. People will feel the difference. Some will be drawn to it, others will be disturbed by it. That's not your concern. You've stopped living reactively, you've stopped managing other people's perceptions, you've stopped performing, and for the first time in your life, you're not scared to disappoint anyone because you're no longer willing to disappoint yourself. You remember the days when you would bend in every direction just to keep the peace, when you tolerate the emotional withdrawal, the vague criticism, the backhanded compliments, the invisible punishments, all because you were afraid that setting a boundary meant losing the person. But now you see it clearly. If someone leaves because you honored your truth, they were never truly with you. They were with the version of you who played small so they could feel big. You're not that version anymore. What you offer now is real, and because it's real, it's rare. You bring presence, not performance, depth, not drama. You don't confuse love with intensity. You don't confuse testing with care. You don't confuse silence with safety. You've rewired the old beliefs. You've unlearned the need to be rescued. You don't want to be saved. You want to be met. And you will be, if not today, then eventually, because the more you show up as your whole self, the more you filter out what isn't meant for you, the more honest you are about your needs, your standards, your limits, the faster people reveal whether they're capable of respecting them. You no longer chase closure, you embody it. You don't explain your absence, you let your peace speak for itself. That's the power of individuation. You become your own anchor. You no longer drift into relationships hoping someone else will ground you. You come in rooted, centered, whole. And because of that, the dynamics that once consumed you now feel repulsive. You don't even entertain them. Not because you're better than anyone, but because you've worked too hard to return to a version of yourself that was never free. You remember what it felt like to lose yourself, to live in constant emotional anticipation, to walk into a conversation and already be preparing your defense. You remember the ache of never feeling quite enough, and you've decided that memory will remain exactly that, a memory, not a pattern, not a lifestyle, not a future. You no longer get lost in other people's storms because you've become the sky. The vastness of your own being is no longer a mystery. You've walked through your shadow and claimed it. You've faced the unconscious, not with judgment, but with compassion. You understand now that the parts of you that once made you chase were never weak. They were just unheard. And now they've been heard, integrated, honored. This is what it means to be a man who has faced the shadow feminine and survived, not by conquering her, but by reclaiming himself. You don't hate her. You don't need revenge. You simply see, and in that seeing, you are free. So if someone asks why you're different now, why you don't chase, why you don't argue, why you don't explain your silence anymore, let them wonder. Let your clarity be your language. Let your absence speak louder than any desperate plea for love ever did. You're not playing the invisible game anymore. You're playing your own. One defined by presence, truth, and sovereignty. Because love is not a battlefield. It's not a performance. It's not a puzzle to solve or a test to pass. Love is a mirror. And now, finally, you've become someone who knows how to look in it and not flinch. There's a moment, quiet, internal, where you realize you no longer crave the version of love you once chased. That moment is subtle, but it changes everything. You stop checking your phone for texts that never come. You stop rehearsing conversations in your mind with people who aren't even listening. You stop replaying the highlight reel of emotional highs and lows like it was something sacred, because now your peace is louder than your longing. And the silence you once feared, it's become your sanctuary. You begin to see relationships not as salvation, but as mirrors, each one reflecting back to you the parts of yourself you've yet to meet. Some bring joy, others bring wounds, but all of them reveal The shadow feminine was never a curse. She was a key. She forced you to look where you never wanted to confront your own patterns, your emotional reflexes, your unspoken needs. She awakened something ancient inside you, not your weakness, but your awareness. And for that, you can be grateful. Because now you are no longer reacting, you are choosing. No longer trying to prove your worth, you are living it. You don't panic when someone pulls away. You don't spiral when someone shows inconsistency. You observe, you listen, and if necessary, you walk. Not because you're unfeeling, but because your self-respect is non-negotiable. That's not ego, that's healing. Jung taught that we don't find ourselves by being loved, we find ourselves by becoming conscious of the unconscious. That means noticing not just what attracts you, but why. Why did the chaos feel like home? Why did the silence feel like safety? Why did you keep returning to what hurt you, hoping it would one day heal you? These aren't just psychological questions, they're spiritual ones. They cut to the core of your being, and the more honestly you answer them, the freer you become. There's a strength that comes from solitude, a quiet, grounded strength that doesn't need to prove anything. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to convince anyone you're worthy of staying. You've stopped fighting to be seen, because now you see yourself. You've stopped trying to be understood by people who aren't even self-aware enough to understand themselves, because now you understand your own depths. You've stopped asking someone else to choose you, because now you choose you. And in this space, everything changes. You show up differently, you speak slower, you listen more. You no longer need to win, you just need to be in alignment. You begin to recognize red flags not as mysteries to solve, but as truths to accept. You don't bargain with them, you don't debate them, you honor what you see the first time. Because your peace is not up for negotiation. Your energy is not currency. Your time is not a donation. The invisible game only had power when you didn't know you were playing. But now you hold the rules. You've taken back the pen. You've stopped performing in someone else's story and started writing your own. A story where you're not the rescuer, not the fixer, not the emotional crutch. You're the man who's walked through fire and come out clean. Not untouched, but reborn. Scarred, maybe, but sacred. And if you ever find yourself slipping, drawn again to that old intensity, that seductive chaos, pause, breathe. Remember who you were before you knew what you know now. Remember how it felt to live reactive, to feel invisible in relationships where you gave everything. Remember how long it took to come home to yourself. That memory is your shield. That insight is your guide. Because you don't need another round of the same lesson. You've already graduated. You've earned your clarity. You've faced your shadow. And now you protect your inner world like it's holy, because it is. No one enters your space unless they match your energy, your values, your depth. Not because you're arrogant, but because you finally understand what your presence is worth. This isn't about demonizing women. It's not about rejecting love. It's about seeing clearly, understanding how unconscious dynamics shaped your pain, how projection disguised itself as passion, how the ache you felt wasn't about her at all. It was about the forgotten parts of yourself begging to be felt. And now that you've felt them, integrated them, honored them, you are free. You can love without losing, you can give without collapsing, you can desire without becoming dependent, and when the shadow feminine appears again, and she will, you'll meet her with open eyes. You won't demonize her, you'll just stay conscious. You'll watch for the withdrawal, the confusion, the emotional baiting, and this time you won't chase. You'll smile, you'll breathe, and you'll walk away, not with bitterness, but with peace. Because you've outgrown the invisible game, you no longer see it as love, you see it as initiation. And you've already passed through the fire. What once broke you now builds you. What once confused you now teaches you, and what once held you hostage now holds no power. You've become the man Jung envisioned, whole, awake, unmanipulable. You are no longer a puppet for someone else's projection. You are no longer a mirror for someone else's unintegrated shadow. You are your own man, rooted, clear, conscious. And from that place you love differently. Not to be completed, but to be mirrored in truth. Not to fix or be fixed, but to walk beside someone who has done the same inner work. You don't fall into love, you rise into it. And if it asks you to shrink, to bend, to perform, you leave. Because the man you are now, he doesn't play games, he builds empires, he sets standards, he protects his peace like it's gold. And it is. So here's your truth. You don't need to win anyone back. You need to win yourself forward. The real relationship, the one you've been aching for, begins with the one you build within. Every other connection is just a reflection of how deeply you honor that. The shadow feminine brought you to this edge, but you chose to leap. And that choice? That's the beginning of everything.